The night in Baton Rouge carried a strange stillness. The swamp breathed with its own rhythm. Frogs croaked in the reeds, insects hummed in the humid air, and somewhere far off an owl broke the silence with its hollow cry. But Samuel did not move. He stood at the edge of the cane fields, his dark silhouette cut against the rising moon, shoulders squared, chest scarred. His eyes, silent, burning, were fixed on the overseer's house. He wasn't looking so much as listening, as though the wood itself whispered of sins committed within. The lamps in the windows flickered, laughter drifted faintly through the air, and Samuel stood as if communing with the ghosts that hovered around the place. The scars across his back glistened like ridges of old fire. Some were faded silver, others still raw from lashings too recent to heal. They told the story of a man who had been broken 100 times, yet refused to crumble. His silence was heavier than chains. The story of Samuel's silence began long before this night. The days were endless rows of cane, sharp-edged leaves slicing skin, sweat stinging the eyes. The overseer's whip cracked not just for disobedience, but for the pace of breath, for the slowing of hands, for no reason at all. Samuel had been whipped until his ribs were visible through the torn flesh of his back, and even then the lashes continued, each strike meant to unmake the man he was. When he collapsed once in the heat, they dragged him by the ankles through the dust, his wrists shackled in iron, his head bouncing against the ground like a thing no longer human. They poured water over him, not to save, but to prolong the workday. His shackles were constant companions, cold and unrelenting. They bit into the bone at his ankles, rubbed the skin raw until the wounds wept. He learned to walk despite the pain, to bear weight where no flesh remained. The overseer said he was stubborn, that he didn't cry enough, didn't beg enough. They wanted brokenness, but what they received was silence. Samuel's silence hardened the others. They whispered his name when the night was darkest, when the overseer's boots thundered past the cabins. Mothers pressed their children close and prayed Samuel's silence would protect them. But silence could not protect everyone. He watched his wife, Rachel, dragged to the trading block in New Orleans. He remembered her eyes, wet and wide, scanning the crowd for him as men appraised her body like livestock. Samuel was held back with shackles and rifle barrels, forced to watch as she was sold to a sugar planter farther south. He would never see her again. The sound of her crying haunted him more than the whip. His son, Isaac, was beaten until he could no longer stand. The boy had not gathered enough cane, his hands too small, too weak. The overseer's whip lashed his back until Samuel lunged forward, but a rifle butt met his jaw, sending him to the dirt. He could not hold his son, could not protect him. He could only lie bleeding, watching Isaac curl into himself, skin split open, sobbing in the dirt. That was the day Samuel's silence became something else. It was no longer submission, it was a furnace. The nights on the plantation were the longest. Darkness carried the sounds of chains dragging across dirt floors, of prayers murmured to a God who seemed far away, of the occasional muffled scream when someone was dragged out for punishment. Samuel lay on his cot, eyes open, listening to the rhythm of suffering. In the stillness, he sometimes thought he could hear Rachel's voice carried on the wind. Other times it was Isaac's cries. But the nights were not only for grief, they were also for whispers. Men and women, bruised and weary, gathered in corners of the quarters, speaking in low tones about escape, about resistance, about vengeance. Most were too afraid to act, for they had seen what came of rebellion, bodies hung from trees, left for the crows. But Samuel listened. He said little, but when the whispers passed through the cabins, his silence was like agreement. The swamp itself seemed to call to him. On stolen nights, when the moon was bright and the dogs were fed enough to sleep, he walked out into the reeds. He listened to the frogs, to the shifting water, to the owls. The swamp was treacherous to the white men who hunted there, but Samuel had been raised in its embrace. As a boy, before chains bound him, he had waded waist-deep with his father, learning which waters held snakes, which reeds concealed quicksand, which trees gave safe footing. That knowledge had not left him. It lingered, waiting. By day he bent under the overseer's eye, sweat dripping into his wounds. By night he dreamed of the swamp's embrace, of its silence, of its cover, and always his eyes burned. It was not sudden, the thought of vengeance. It grew slow, like cane stalks reaching for sun, watered by blood and humiliation. Each lash, each cry, each act of cruelty sharpened it. The overseers believed silence meant defeat. They did not know silence could sharpen a blade sharper than steel. One evening, as the overseer's house erupted with laughter and drunken shouts, Samuel slipped behind the cabins. A rusted sickle, discarded in the dirt, caught his eye. He picked it up, tested its weight in his hand. The blade was chipped, the handle worn, but Samuel's grip was steady. He sat in the shadows, whetstone in hand, dragging it slow across the steel. SHHHK, SHHHK. The sound was low, steady, deliberate. Children watched him from the doorways of cabins, their eyes wide. Women drew their shawls tight. None spoke. They knew the sound was not just the sharpening of steel, it was the sound of something inevitable. Samuel's face did not change. His silence did not waver. Only the steady motion of his hand dragging stone against metal, sparks catching briefly in the night. The overseer's laughter carried across the field, mingling with the sharpening. When the blade was done, Samuel set it across his lap and the moonlight kissed its edge. He did not smile, he did not whisper, he simply waited. And in that silence, the story of vengeance began. The air that night was thick with the smell of roasting meat, sweet liquor, and smoke curling from lanterns strung high around the great house. Cane fields swayed in the humid breeze like silent witnesses as the Baton Rouge planters gathered for their feast. Horses tied at the gate stamped impatient hooves, their riders already drunk on rum and self-importance. Carriages lined the dirt road, lacquered wheels shining under torchlight. It was not just a dinner. It was a ritual of power, a pageant of men congratulating themselves for the suffering they had inflicted on others. Inside, laughter roared like thunder. Overseers, planters, and merchants crowded the long table. Bottles clinked, cards shuffled, dice rolled across polished wood. Their voices rose in the same rhythm as their cruelty, boastful, booming, unashamed. They traded stories not of harvests or trade, but of flesh and pain. One told of how he'd made a man crawl through broken glass for stealing corn. Another bragged of a woman whipped until she miscarried, her body left in the sun. Each tale was met with jeers, with slaps on the back, with more drink poured. And moving through them like a shadow was Samuel. He carried trays stacked with roasted pork, biscuits, and bottles of rum. His head was bowed low, eyes hidden beneath the flicker of candlelight. He stepped silently, never stumbling, though his shackles clinked faintly with every movement. To them, he was invisible, no more human than the silver platter in his hands. But Samuel's silence was not empty, it was watching, it was measuring. His eyes flicked briefly, memorizing faces, counting laughs, marking cruelty like tallies on a page. The room's cruelty did not stay contained to the table. At one corner of the hall, a girl no older than 12 was dragged in by her hair. One of the overseers shoved her forward as though she were part of the entertainment. This one, he sneered, couldn't keep her eyes down, thought she was better than the field. The men roared with laughter, their teeth flashing in the firelight. He forced her to her knees, yanking her head back so her face was lifted toward the guests. They mocked her trembling, made wagers on how long before she fainted if the whip struck her again. The whip cracked across her back. Her body jolted, a gasp torn from her throat. The crowd cheered. For them, this was sport, pain as a diversion, suffering as proof of their dominion. Samuel did not move, his face a mask, his tray steady in his hands. But inside, the fire spread. He watched the girl's tears streak her cheeks and saw, not for the first time, the truth of this world. Cruelty was not accident here. It was entertainment. Later, another young man stumbled as he carried a jug of wine. The glass slipped, shattered against the floor. The hall fell silent for a beat. Then the overseer closest to him grinned. Clumsy dogs need reminding. He lashed the boy across the face, sending him crashing into the shards. Blood mingled with wine across the floorboards, and the guests laughed harder, demanding another round of cards. Samuel was ordered to step over the body to refill their cups as though nothing had happened. He obeyed outwardly, but in his chest his heart beat steady, each thump echoing like a drum of war. The feast stretched on until the night deepened, until men slumped in their chairs, mouths stained with grease, eyes blurred with drink. They sang crude songs, pounded the table, and fell asleep in their victory over those they called less than human. To them, the world was secure, their power unshaken. But out in the quarters, the night told a different story. Samuel returned to the cabins after the feast, carrying with him not just the smell of spilled rum, but the weight of what he had seen. The girl lay on a cot, her back raw with fresh lashes. The boy's face was split open, blood drying in dark trails along his cheek. Samuel knelt beside them both. His hands, though calloused from cane and scarred from chains, were gentle. He pressed cloth against wounds, whispered nothing but let his silence be a balm. His silence said, "I see you, I will not forget." In the far corner of the quarters sat Elijah, an old man whose hair was white as ash and whose back was bent from years of lashes. He beckoned Samuel close. The firelight lit his face in uneven shadows, eyes sunken but still sharp. His voice, cracked but steady, carried a secret he had long guarded. "The town sleeps deep after their feasts," Elijah whispered, his eyes darting toward the door as though afraid the very walls might listen. "They drink themselves blind, dogs fed too fat to bark, guards nodding where they stand. A man could walk through Baton Rouge like death itself." If he had no fear, Samuel said nothing. His silence was his answer. He met Elijah's gaze, and in that gaze something passed between them, something that needed no words. Elijah nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth long denied but now alive again. That night, when the cabins grew still and even the injured drifted into restless sleep, Samuel sat alone. The sickle he had sharpened the night before rested against the beam above his cot. He reached up, fingers brushing the rough wood, and with the tip of a nail he carved one notch, then another. 9 in total, etched side by side into the grain of the beam. Each mark was deep, deliberate, a wound in the wood. He sat in the moonlight, filtering through the cracks of the cabin, staring at the 9 cuts. They were not names written in ink, but in silence, in rage, in patience. The town believed he was broken, a mute shadow bound in iron. But Samuel was not broken. Samuel was waiting. And the notches promised that when the town next feasted, it would not be only laughter echoing in Baton Rouge. The night in Baton Rouge lay heavy as a coffin lid. The revelry had burned itself out hours ago. Men who had roared with laughter now slumped in drunken stupor, mouths open, snores rolling through shuttered windows. Dogs, bellies swollen from scraps, slept in the dust. The last lanterns guttered, their flames bending low, casting long shadows against walls. It was the kind of silence that felt like a held breath. Out in the cane fields, Samuel stood barefoot, the sickle glinting in his hand. His eyes burned, not with madness, not with frenzy, but with a cold, unbending clarity. He moved forward as though called by the silence itself. Each step was careful, each breath measured. The swamp and the fields had taught him how to move without stirring a sound. Tonight, every lesson became weapon. The overseer's house was first. Its wooden frame creaked as Samuel pressed the door open, a sigh of hinges masked by the man's heavy snore inside. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and cruelty. Samuel's shadow stretched across the floorboards as he moved closer. The overseer lay sprawled on his back, mouth slack, the whip that had torn Isaac's skin hanging from a nail above the bed like a trophy. Samuel's chest rose once steady, then the sickle descended. The overseer's throat split open, a wet gasp gurgling into silence. Samuel did not linger. He turned his face away from the whip, eyes dry, and stepped back into the night. The second house sat closer to town. The trader who had bought Rachel, her soft voice, her desperate hands reaching toward Samuel as chains dragged her away, slept with his boots still on, sprawled across a chair. Samuel remembered her scream the day she was sold. He remembered her silence afterward, carried away. He leaned close enough to smell the man's sour breath before the sickle whispered across his throat. The trader's eyes shot open, wide and panicked, but no cry escaped. His last breath bubbled red, his boots twitching before stillness claimed him. Samuel wiped nothing. He left the blood where it fell. The drunkard came next. The man who had branded Samuel's back with hot iron, laughing as the flesh seared, calling it a mark of ownership. Samuel found him collapsed against his porch, bottle rolling in the dirt. He slit the man's throat as easily as he might cut cane. The drunkard gurgled once, tried to lift the bottle to his lips, then slumped sideways, face down in the mud. The brand on Samuel's back burned phantom hot, but he did not touch it. He only stepped forward, the sickle steady, his silence deeper than the swamp. The deputy was harder. He had been young once, loud with cruelty, laughing as children were whipped, daring the overseers to strike harder. His house was guarded by 2 dogs. Samuel crouched in the dark, tossing a bone soaked in rum-soaked grease toward them. They sniffed, whined, lapped, and soon their heads dropped heavy to the ground. Samuel slipped inside like smoke. The deputy's laughter seemed to echo in memory even as he snored. Samuel stood over him, sickle poised, his face expressionless. One clean motion ended it. The laughter stopped forever. One by one, Samuel walked the town as though death itself had taken human form. Each man he chose was not random, not convenient, but bound to his suffering. Memory guided his blade. The card player who cheated slaves of their rations, leaving children hungry. The jailer who locked men in the stocks until their skin blistered under the sun. The overseer's cousin who had pressed a pistol to Samuel's head once for amusement, pulling the trigger on an empty chamber just to watch him flinch. Each face was written in the scars of Samuel's body. Each throat opened beneath the sickle. The night grew heavier, each kill pulling a thread from the tapestry of the town's security. Doors creaked, floorboards whispered beneath his steps, but never loud enough to rouse the drunk and the blind. He moved with the patience of water carving stone, inevitable and silent, his breath never quickened, his eyes never softened. In one house, a lantern flickered low, casting a glow on family portraits hung above a mantel. Samuel paused, studying them, not with envy, not with longing, but with a kind of hollow recognition. These men built their lives on the backs of others, lives that would now end in their beds. The lantern guttered once more as if acknowledging his presence, then went dark as Samuel's blade whispered again. The blood trail grew. By the 7th kill, Samuel's hands were slick, his forearms painted with red. He did not wipe them clean. He carried the blood with him, a mark of every wound he had endured, every injustice now balanced. The 8th man stirred as Samuel entered, eyes flickering open. For a heartbeat, he looked directly into Samuel's gaze. There was no scream, only the dawning horror of recognition that the silence they mocked, the silence they underestimated, had come to claim them. Samuel's sickle flashed and the horror ended. By the 9th, the night itself seemed to lean closer. Baton Rouge lay asleep, its dogs dreaming, its masters breathing drunken breaths, unaware of the storm passing silently through their homes. Samuel's final victim gargled one last time before slumping against his sheets, crimson spreading like ink across linen. The silence afterward was suffocating. 9 men lay in their homes, their throats cut clean. No dogs barked, no alarms rang, only the steady drip of blood into the floorboards spoke of what had happened. Samuel stepped into the street. The eastern sky carried the faintest bruising of dawn. He did not rush. He walked as a man unbound, blood on his hands, the sickle still sharp. His bare feet left no prints the town could follow. The air smelled of cane, of river mud, and of death. He did not look back. He crossed the dirt road, passed the last lantern, and slipped into the cane fields. The stalks swallowed him whole, their leaves whispering against his arms as though welcoming him home. By the time the roosters crowed and the first woman opened her shutters to the morning, Samuel was gone. The screams began soon after, the wails of wives finding their husbands' throats slit, the shouts of riders galloping into town. Panic spread like fire across Baton Rouge, but Samuel was no longer there to hear. The sun rose red over Baton Rouge, bleeding into the cane fields like fire across the horizon. By then, the screams had already begun. Doors burst open, wives shrieked, servants fled into the streets with trembling hands over their mouths. 9 men, overseers, traders, deputies, pillars of the town's dominion, lay in their beds with throats cut to silence. The town had awoken in blood. Panic spread like fever. Riders mounted in haste, muskets strapped to their backs, eyes wild. The church bells tolled, not for prayer but for alarm. Men barked orders, women wailed, children clung to skirts. Whispers galloped faster than horses. A slave did this. A ghost did this. Death itself passed through Baton Rouge while we slept. By mid-morning, the swamp was alive with shouts and the frantic baying of dogs. Posse after posse thundered out, torches flickering in the daylight, rifles gleaming. They scoured the cane rows, combed the river's edge, drove their hounds into the bogs. But Samuel had already melted into the reeds, barefoot and silent, as if the swamp itself had opened its arms to receive him. The hounds caught his scent once, baying in triumph, but Samuel knew their hunger. He waded waist-deep into the water, sliding along the roots of cypress trees, letting the current wash his sweat away. He pressed himself into the mud until even the frogs mistook him for stone. The dogs hit the bank, circled, whined, then scattered in confusion. Their masters cursed, yanked leashes, struck them with whips, but the swamp devoured the trail. The hunters fared no better. Horses sank in the sucking mud, hooves trapped until riders were thrown into the mire. Muskets misfired in damp hands. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, biting until men swore and slapped at the air. Every step forward seemed to cost them something, boots lost, tempers fraying, the swamp swallowing whatever pride they had carried with them. Samuel moved where they could not. He slipped through narrow channels where water ran black and still, knowing which vines concealed quicksand and which logs hid cottonmouths. He ducked beneath lily pads, his breath controlled, body still, until the riders passed overhead. He was not just surviving the swamp, he was using it, turning every hazard into shield. As the hunt pressed deeper, memories rose with the murk. Samuel saw himself as a boy, no more than 8, following his father into these same reeds. The man's voice had been low, steady, teaching him how to read the swamp like scripture. Listen to the frogs, they tell you where the water's safe. Watch the owls, they warn of strangers before dogs do. Step where the cypress roots rise, not where the mud swallows. Samuel remembered his father's hand guiding his small body through waist-high water, showing him how to move without ripples, how to let the swamp carry him rather than fight it. Those nights, they would sit at the water's edge, watching fireflies drift like sparks. His father would murmur, "This land remembers us. One day it may be the only thing that saves us." Now, years later, that prophecy breathed through Samuel's every step. The swamp remembered, and it protected him. By noon, the heat was merciless. Men stripped their coats, cursed the insects, drank greedily from flasks. Dogs lay panting, tongues lolling, refusing to rise. Arguments broke out among the hunters. One shouted that Samuel had fled south, another swore he doubled back. Fingers jabbed, tempers flared, muskets waved. More than once, the swamp claimed a man in the chaos. A horse tumbling into quicksand, dragging its rider under. A scream splitting the air as a snake's fangs sank into a leg. A rifle discharging too close, leaving another howling in pain. The swamp was not Samuel's only weapon, it became his ally, his accomplice. Now and again, someone swore they saw him. Once, through a curtain of fog rising off the water, a figure appeared, tall, still, barefoot, blood on his arms, eyes burning like coals. He stood for a heartbeat, sickle glinting at his side before slipping back into the mist. The posse shouted, fired blindly, but the swamp absorbed the bullets, swallowing the echoes. When the fog cleared, he was gone. By evening, the men's courage had curdled into dread. No one spoke Samuel's name anymore. They whispered instead of spirits of vengeance made flesh, of the swamp itself rising to shield him. The bravado of Baton Rouge faltered. Elijah's whisper had been true. A man with no fear could walk through the town like death itself. And now in the swamps, Samuel was no longer merely a man. His silence had become legend. The hunters trudged back toward town as night fell, torches burning low, shoulders bent with exhaustion. Their numbers were fewer than when they had set out. Some had drowned, others bitten, others lost in the bog. They told themselves they would return, that Samuel could not hide forever. Yet each knew in the hollow of his chest that the swamp had claimed him, not as prey, but as its own. And in Baton Rouge, whispers grew. Mothers hushed children with his name. Overseers looked over their shoulders. 9 men lay buried, and one man, silent, scarred, unseen, walked in the reeds. Samuel was still flesh and blood, lungs filling with the damp night air, body weary from the hunt. But already his legend was being born. The swamp opened wider the farther Samuel walked, its cypress roots rising like cathedral columns, its waters black as spilled ink. He moved deeper with every step until the sound of hounds and riders was nothing but a distant memory. The cane fields, the overseer's whip, the laughter of planters, all faded behind him. Ahead lay only wilderness, unbroken and endless, a world where no white hand could reach him. He did not rush. His body bore fatigue, his skin carried blood not his own, but his silence remained steady. He walked barefoot across wet earth, listening to frogs croak in low chorus, owls marking the hours with lonely calls. The swamp seemed to breathe with him, to close behind him as though erasing his trail. Samuel was no longer hunted. He had become untouchable. Back in Baton Rouge, the town staggered under its own fear. 9 coffins lined the churchyard by week's end, each one lowered into the ground beneath a sky heavy with storm. The funerals were hushed, stripped of boasting. Men who once filled the night with raucous laughter now bowed their heads, eyes darting over their shoulders. No sermon offered comfort, every word carried the weight of terror. The masters forbade Samuel's name. In their homes, it was spoken only in whispers, if at all. They feared the power of syllables, the way a single name could ignite courage among the enslaved. So they buried him in silence, as if silence could erase the fact that one man had undone them. But the quarters remembered. Around dying fires, among bruised bodies and weary hands, Samuel's story was told, not in shouts, not in songs, but in low voices that trembled between awe and fear. Children asked, did he really walk into their houses? Old men nodded, eyes reflecting both grief and pride. Women whispered prayers for his soul, torn between mourning and hope. He became both warning and memory, a man who endured the lash, the shackles, the sale of his wife, the beating of his child, and who answered not with cries but with silence sharpened into steel. Yet Samuel's story was not made into legend that night. He was no myth with wings or fire. He was flesh, bone, scar, and blood. And he was alone. At the edge of the swamp, Samuel paused. The Mississippi rolled wide before him, its waters glinting under a veiled moon. He stood on the bank, chest rising with slow breaths, sickle still at his side. The river had carried away his wife, sold down its course into hands unknown. It had carried away men he had known, chained to boats bound south. Now it offered him no answers, only silence. He crouched at the water's edge, cupping the current in his palm. The river was cool, alive, rushing toward horizons unseen. He let it slip through his fingers, dripping back into its own body. For the first time in years, his eyes closed not in pain but in exhaustion. Samuel did not imagine glory. He did not dream of monuments or rebellion sung across generations. His vengeance was not for crowns or songs. It was for balance. Each throat cut was not triumph but a weight lifted from his soul, a burden set down into the swamp's dark belly. He had not destroyed Baton Rouge. He had not freed the chains from every back. But he had answered cruelty with silence, pain with precision. And in that balance, he found something like peace. The town behind him would never sleep the same. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a lantern at night would remind them that silence could kill as surely as a bullet. They would live with that terror, just as Samuel had lived with theirs. The dawn came gray. Fog unrolled across the swamp, rising from the water like a shroud. Samuel rose to his feet, the sickle hanging loosely at his side. He stepped forward barefoot into the mist. Each stride carried him farther from the world that had tried to unmake him. His figure blurred, then faded, swallowed by fog. Behind him lay 9 graves. Ahead, only silence. The swamp closed its arms and Samuel disappeared. Samuel's silence shook an entire town, leaving fear where once there was arrogance. If you lived in Baton Rouge that night, would you have remembered him as a ghost or as justice itself? Tell us what you think in the comments, and if stories like this haunt and move you, subscribe for more powerful tales of history, vengeance, and survival.